Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Fast Track Your Early Clinical Development Lifecycle, presented by Medidata Solutions. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor to Fierce Pharma, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. You can find additional answers to some common technical issues located in the Help button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Q&A button on the left side of your screen, and you can do that throughout the presentation. I think we're ready to begin. According to a recent industry survey, 80% of respondents agreed that early phase studies are becoming more complex. To compete, sponsors are under pressure to contain costs and timelines, while also addressing increasingly demanding study requirements. We've assembled an expert panel to help you understand the trends, the effects of these trends, and what steps you can take to address the new challenges. Joining us today are Teresa Barnott, Manager Implementation Consulting at Medidata Solutions, Keith Wenzel, Senior Director, Parexel Technology Partner Program, and Karen Green, Senior Director, Clinical Data Management at 47 Inc. Thank you all for taking your time to share your expertise. And for the audience, you can read each of their bios on the right side of your window. I think we'll start off with some introductions. Why don't you all tell us about your company, current role, and experience in early phase trials. Karen, let's start with you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Karen Green. I'm the Senior Director of Clinical Data Management at 47. 47 is a small startup biotech company focusing on oncology. During my approximately 20-plus year career, I've worked mostly at small and mid-sized biotech companies in the Bay Area, and I've experienced across a variety of indications and anything from Phase I to Phase III studies. The last 10 years, I've been primarily in oncology companies, and I've worked in a number of models for outsourcing to get the job done. Anything from full in-house model to hybrid functional outsourcing, and also to a full outsourcing model. And I think our next presenter is Keith.
That's right, Keith, go ahead.
I appreciate that handover. Good morning, everybody. My name is Keith Wenzel. I'm a Senior Director at Parexel International. I have an e-clinical background, including electronic clinical outcome assessments as a product manager. Parexel has extensive experience with EDC systems, including we've built over 250 RAVE studies. And as a full-service CRO, we overlay classic clinical research services on top of the EDC, including feasibility assessment, studies and subject recruitment, trial oversight, monitoring, including risk-based monitoring and risk-based study execution, data analysis, and regulatory submissions, including supporting meetings with regulators and payers. We have subject matter experts in Phase II, Phase III, late phase, observational and non-interventional trials, market access, in addition to Phase I, the subject of today's panel. And I believe the next panelist is Teresa. Teresa, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Keith, so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your attendance today. My name is Teresa Barnott, and I work for Medidata Solutions. You may know we're the global leader in life sciences platform and software as a service, as well as we're most well known for our RAVE EDC system. I'm a manager of implementation consulting in our professional services department, and I manage a team of implementation consultants focusing on study-by-study builds, meaning my team, including myself, we actually do the configurations. We do all the study building, we do the consulting. I have over 15 years experience working in the pharmaceutical and life sciences industry, with 10 years experience designing and building EDC and related systems, such as RTSM, TSDV, coding, etc. I've worked across all phases and therapeutic areas. Prior to doing this type of build work, I worked as a data manager, so that's my foundation in my clinical experience. And prior to that, I worked as a QA and manufacturing specification editor. My area of expertise is early stage phase 1 trials as well as oncology study design.
Teresa, thank you. So for the entire panel, our first question up is, what trends do you see impacting early phase trials, and how are they affecting the study team? Teresa, why don't we start with you?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Joe. So simply stated, protocols are becoming more complex. I think any of us in this industry are seeing that happening. The need to have adaptable study designs is increasing. From what I've observed, we're seeing more targeted therapy investigations up front. So where we're looking at target patient populations with a particular type of cancer or rare disease. And as such, there's more complex data to collect and more data in general. Also, teams are seeking more real-time or direct patient data. So long gone are those days of simple phase 1 PK studies. We're looking at collecting PROs, mobile sensor data, et cetera. So why is that? And that's because we need to fail fast, right? We need these quicker go, no-go decisions because the cost of research is significantly increasing, and so teams need to minimize the money and time invested so that they can move on either to the subsequent phases or the next project.
Keith, I think you're up at bat next.
Sure. I concur with Teresa. Getting to that go, no-go decision quickly is vitally important, especially considering that we've got scarce resources, and we want to guide those towards the safe and efficacious drugs. Another trend that's out there is the introduction of adaptive elements into early phase trials. And that really can be a challenge as the study design can change substantially at each decision point. For example, the event table can have minor or substantive changes, which means additional EDC programming and validation. Obviously, the money is available for phase 1 early phase trials continues to be in short supply. Hybrid trials are also being introduced. Those are the ones that start with a phase 1 but end up looking like a 2B or even a early 3A. Is a final trend that I'm observing.
Karen?
Great. Yeah, hi. So Teresa and Keith have really captured kind of the things we are seeing happening these days with the complexity of studies. And in the name of full disclosure, I do have to add that Teresa and I have worked together the last about 3 years at my current company and at a previous company. So the complexity she's seeing is my fault or the fault of some of the companies I've been at. So we've had some shared experience. But I can speak on the sponsor side of it for, why are we doing this? Why are we making these crazy complex protocols? And, we're starting out right now at the company I'm at. We're in early phase oncology research. So when we started with our first in human phase 1 oncology study, we had to cast a really wide net, for the indication. And we're obviously starting at very low doses to go through a dose escalation. So once we started seeing efficacious dose or possibly efficacious dose, that was the time we needed to start narrowing down our indication and move from what was a general solid tumor study to look at more specific tumor types. So the way we could do that is start up new protocols with all of the costs associated with that for a small sample size of 12 to 20 subjects to see what we're looking at as far as signals. But there's a cost of the CROs to get on board, hiring more people, bringing additional sites on board. There's a lot to go with starting an entirely new protocol. So what we've done primarily is add a cohort into an existing study. You already have sites on board who are solid tumor focused sites, so they can easily just switch over to looking at different tumor types to enroll in a study. These are sites that are familiar with what we're doing, so we don't have to retrain them. We have a CRO on board. So all of the startup costs, while there's obviously going to be increased costs because of the complexity of the study, It's not on just opening sites. So it's a lot easier to start up a new cohort than to start a whole entire protocol. But it makes it for a very complex protocol with multi-arms, multi-doses, multi-indications, possibly different response criteria. The complexity is pretty high on that. But the exchange is we hopefully get to a faster identification of the target indication that we want so that we can move forward on starting new protocols for our Phase II, Phase III studies and be a little bit more targeted once we get to that point.
So the next question for the panel is, how do you recommend organizations address these shifts? Keith, why don't we start off with you?
Sure. So first off, if you're utilizing an adaptive design, then you're getting a head start and you can make your late-stage trials more efficient. So, those adaptive designs really can be advantageous to you. It's really important that you be thoughtful in your study design across all of the envisioned permutations, which Karen just spoke about, to minimize rework and new programming. You need to find the right balance between keeping the design simple, but also anticipating the pivot points. That's a delicate but achievable balance. Standards can make a real difference. Sponsor-specific standards can make a difference, but they do take time to evolve. You start without standards and then you build over time. Quite often, CROs will have a set of pre-existing Phase I early phase standards that might be able to be leveraged. So you should consider consulting with your CRO partners and leveraging their expertise and some substantial experience. To the extent that local labs can be pre-validated and standardized to minimize the data cleaning, that can make a real difference. It's a serious pain point in early phase trials. Having experienced staff makes a really big difference too. Those people that not only understand EDC and study design in general, but really experts within early phase, both from a site perspective and a technology partner perspective, can make a real difference. So, upfront design work can ensure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck. Take the time necessary to plan out what is truly needed to be collected, and avoid adding the nice-to-haves if they do not add value to your primary endpoints or decision considerations.
Karen, what's your take?
Yeah, I think Keith definitely touched on part of that. Very good points, Keith. The standard is really one of the things that can help any company move quickly with the next protocol. I've been at large companies where there's a full standards committee and any deviation from the standard has to go through that committee for approval, and that keeps things very controlled and makes a startup actually go relatively fast because people usually just stick with the standard and don't even ask for those deviations. But in the environment I'm in now, we're busy focusing on getting these studies started up, so we don't have time for extra committees to regulate standards. But that doesn't mean we don't have standards. We just use our previous study as kind of a de facto standard when we're starting up a new study. So utilizing systems, not just the EDC system, but an IRT or the CTMS system from our ClinOps folks, using those same systems from one study to the next. There's just not a learning curve that people have to go through to get going on the next protocol. On the EDC side, if we're using case report forms that are standard from one study to the next, there's also a huge impact in the downstream efficiencies for our stats and stats programming group. When we're going through early phase I studies and doing dose escalation, we enroll 3 patients and then have to report on whether we're going to go to the next dose level. We need to have the data that's entered in quickly, and any tables and listings generated quickly. There's usually not much time to do like 12-week lead-in for new programming. So using data that looks the same as a previous study, we can use the same programs from one study to the next. It also helps with our corporate decision making, so we can make decisions quickly about what indication that we're going in. But there's this weird balance where at the same time, I'll say we have to have standards, we have to keep standards and keep to the consistency. But then in this adaptive environment where we're switching to different indications and different dose levels, well, we have to have these standards. The standards themselves need to be flexible and adaptable. So if we lock in that the answer always has to be yes or no, what happens when it's maybe, or what happens when it's unknown? If we say we're going to start with a dose level of 1, 2, and 3, what happens when we go to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? So there's definitely value in standards, but as we all know, the world's not perfect. You have to make adjustments along the way. And that allows us, you know, as a protocol amendment may occur, we need to be able to quickly move to having those patients enrolled and being able to collect that data. So my emphasis are two very extremes from keeping with the standards, but at the same time have the adaptability and the flexibility that you're going to need to collect the data in the real world. Teresa, how about your experience?
Oh, thanks, Karen. So yeah, I absolutely agree with both Keith and Karen. You want to strike a balance between simple, but it has to be adaptable, right? So you want it to be streamlined, and you know, you want to be consistent, but you need to be adaptable. As Karen said, you want to be smart with your standards, right? Anticipate where your changes are going to be, and always keeping in mind when we're doing this, as Karen said, it's a balance between simple and adaptable, but also at the end, our end goal, by utilizing standards, or what I'm going to call smart standards, you enable your stats programming to be able to generate your end data more quickly and efficiently, and that's what we really need, right? We need to know, you guys need to know what that outcome is so you can make those decisions or report on those decisions. This balance is achievable. From a technology perspective, I really feel strongly that you want to lay a foundation, a solid foundation early to allow for that cleaner data that's faster to obtain with tools that are sophisticated and adaptable, and ideally even integratable, not necessarily now, but maybe in the future, as Karen and Keith were speaking to, thinking of, you know, future situations where you might be using an IRT or an RTSM or CTMS. I personally feel that it's best to invest the time and effort up front. For example, if you think about how your study workflow is, you know, as you're setting out to implement technology and setting up, you know, your conduct in these early phase studies, think about what your workflow is. Think about how you envision your team and your data. How do you envision that operating? And then, as Karen said, you know, especially with, we see the rise, we work with a lot of small partners as well as large partners. These smaller partners, you can't always have a whole, you know, standards committee or things in place like that. So this is where you really want to partner with the experts in the industry to implement. So you want to allow these experts, such as, you know, our metadata consultants or a CRO such as Parexel, to guide you with the best practices. So I can speak personally for metadata. We want to be your trusted advisors. We want to be partners in your success. We don't want you to reinvent the wheel each time. You shouldn't have to reinvent things like demographics and vitals and things like that. We want you to focus on the items that are the utmost importance to you, which is namely your key endpoints. Doing this allows you to be set up for success in the future. So that solid base in content and technology can be perpetuated forward, as both Keith and Karen said. You know, you save the setup time going forward, you save the reinvention of programming and such, and that ultimately decreases your overall cost and time to execute. In reality, you may not need a whole platform for a first-in-human phase 1 trial, but you will need to collect trial data and code drugs and events and minimize your manual work and manipulation. And if you start off with that best technology, you can build upon that as your IP succeed and grow into later phases where you will need a broader expanse of technology.
Okay, our next question for the panel is, how do you justify the cost of more technology in earlier phases? Karen, we're going to put you in the spotlight first.
Okay, great. Yeah, this, you know, cost is obviously a very important question. As a small biotech, we need to be really careful about our resources. So there's a limited amount of money we have in the bank to spend right now, and we want to spend it wisely. But it's also the resources we have are not just the money, but it's the time and the people resources as well. So we want to make wise choices about the spending money on technology that will help us advance our program efficiently. Systems that will allow us to manage and have oversight of our data, our clinical site, and our CRO partners. So it's not really the decision we want to make is to do the cheapest solution or the most, the low-cost solution up front. You see a lot of times there's just Excel spreadsheet trackers for everything, and that seems like a cheap solution, and it's not going to cost us much money. But then when you take a look at a person who is spending possibly half of their week keeping up on these various trackers, you've just spent about the same cost as setting up a system to do it for you, and it could be a much, much more cost-effective solution if you're looking at how much money you're spending in the long run. At the same time as we're starting up with the early research and early phase 1 studies, we're optimistic. We're hoping our product's going to go further. We want to be able to be prepared for our later phase 2 studies or phase 3 studies. So we don't want to start with a solution in phase 1 that's not really scalable. So one of the things that I was really drawn to about 47, where I am right now, is as a small startup biotech company, they really had the long-term vision to take a look at the systems we're going to use. Even on our EDC system, we did a full vendor selection. RFP bids went out. We had 3 different vendors come in and do presentations. And we went with really what solution was going to help us in the long run. And we've done that across all of our other systems that we're using. So I think it's really important to not just look at the dollars you're going to spend today on something, but look at what it's going to cost you over the life of your study, over the life of your program. And if you're at a company that's expanding and has a great pipeline, not just at the current program, but all the programs that may be coming down the line.
Keith, how do you justify the cost of more technology in earlier phases?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. As Karen said, resources are in such short supply, so you really do need to be smart here. And Karen made the point earlier, but let me reemphasize it. Technology that can be reused in subsequent trials with no or minimal additional programming or integrations can really make a difference in terms of your technology investment over time. Technology gets you to a no-go decision so that you're not spending money on continuing research that's not really going to be viable at the end of the day is another example. Connected sensors and wearables are kind of an interesting trend and an area where people are choosing to invest or not. By introducing a connected sensor or a wearable in a phase 1 trial, it allows you to begin understanding the relationship between the sensor data and the other study data. And in fact, it might be that the sensor, the wearable data, will start showing you a signal earlier than the classic in clinic study data. So, and then in addition, by introducing a sensor or wearable early, you can understand the human interface requirements, like the support required, instructions needed, the burden on the site, the burden on the subject. So you're kind of learning side by side for promising compounds where sensors are going to make a difference, and you can develop the sensor right alongside the compound that you're developing. And I think, Teresa, you probably have a couple of observations from your perspective as well.
Yeah, thank you, Keith. So I agree with my colleagues completely. I mean, there's so many costs to consider, both short and longer term, and it's easy for us to think short term because you folks on the phone, you have to spend that money now. You have to say, I need this much money now, and it's hard to think long term when you have to spend so much up front. But there are costs, not just monetary, as Karen and Keith are both saying. There's time and effort on the study team, the sites, the patients. I think Keith made an excellent point, even lessons learned, right? As you're using technology, you don't want to be having to deal with those lessons learned the first time around when you're on a huge Phase II or Phase III. It's much easier to mitigate when you're on a smaller trial where you get to work through that as your product's growing and really develop it into what you want it to be, so that when you really get to your big studies, your big impactful studies that you're hoping take you to the finish line, you've worked out those kinks. I think we all can relate to the sentiment. You get what you pay for, right? You want high quality systems. We all want that. It's hard sometimes to invest up front, but you need those systems. You want the necessary support, not just from study startup, but I think as Karen said, sometimes we forget about study closeout, the end goal. You need better oversight. You need tools that allow you for better oversight and decision making on your research projects. If you're willing to make those initial technology investments long term, that investment can and will ultimately help you reduce many of the future costs of time and people. So I have a couple real world examples here. So certainly, as we've mentioned before, there's savings in time to develop your systems by having the ability to reuse content, either from a library or, as Karen mentioned, just previous studies. Starting to lay a good solid foundation, as I said earlier, investing the time up front, having your foundation, being able to perpetuate that forward, and then it decreases your cost per project. So I'd give a direct example. At Medidata, if you sign up for a fixed price project, a fixed price study build, those EDC costs are driven by unique and total form count. And if you can reuse content, not only does your study build time inherently be shorter going forward because you've already built half or more of the content in previous studies, but it reduces your unique form count costs. So you start reaping significant benefits going forward. I know Karen and I have personally experienced that as we worked on study builds together. Next, we often think about startup costs because that's where I feel like we see it most. We're embarking on a new project, and as Karen said earlier, you're looking at site initiation and training and getting your systems up, and there's a lot of startup costs and money and time associated with clinical research. But also, I don't want you to lose sight of, I want you to consider things like your time to close out your study before you can even analyze the data to make those critical no-go decisions or ultimate, final decisions about it. Using that right technology to the fullest capability can streamline this process. So instead of using smart sheets or spreadsheets, again, another example, in previous years when I worked for a large pharma where we went from a mix of paper and a few miscellaneous EDC systems or an internal database, we made a full investment into Rave EDC, and we reduced our average time from last patient out to database lock from 80 days to 5 days. And I'm sure you've all heard, time is money. Every day is millions of dollars that our drugs and devices aren't out there. So 80 to 5 days is significant, but the only way we were able to do that is to really commit and dive into the technology. And another thought is, think beyond EDC long term. So we talk a lot about using the tools to conduct our trials, such as, again, EDC, CTMS, RGSM, et cetera. But another thing to consider is now we have smart tools available, analytic data tools, where you can start reaping the benefits of those sooner that would otherwise not necessarily be available if you aren't using that underlying technology that those analytic tools rely on. So not just your core data systems, but above that, there are tools, for example, Medidata offers patient profiles and strategic monitoring and insights, and where you can look for data anomalies and potential issues that may, again, help you achieve those long-term go, no-go decisions sooner. So these are just some examples of how that investment in technology leads to significant cost savings long-term. And as my colleague stated, and I agree, ultimately the end goal justifies the upfront investment.
Sorry, I had a little technical issue. Panel, why don't we move on to the audience Q&A? First, I'd like to remind the audience there's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We already have a lot of great questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So the first question up is for Teresa. How have you been able to support clients in mitigating the cost and time required to set up early Phase I trials?
Thanks, Joe, and thanks everyone for asking. So certainly we respect, we want you to take advantage of the technology, but, we understand the cost sensitivities, right? So we share that feeling. We're invested in your success, and we know that that's a challenge for folks. And so we want you to work with us, but we want to help mitigate those costs and those efforts, right? We want to help you be successful and get the best bang for your buck. So how have we done this? So one example I can give, this may sound oversimplified, but the nature of what you want to study ultimately drives the type of data you collect, right? So in early phase trials, no matter how many cohorts or arms or what you're looking for, ultimately what you need to learn is consistent, right? We're looking for dose finding or max tolerated dose or food effect or, things of that sort, right? We're looking for all kinds of different things, but they're generally consistent no matter how complex the trial is. And so ultimately, because of the data you need to collect, those procedures required to obtain that data for analysis is actually consistent, right? Again, procedurally, ECGs, vitals, different sample collections, et cetera, response assessments. At Medidata, I actually lead an expert team with a combined experience of over 40 years. We developed an implementation offering that's referred to as our Phase I offering. It's a fully functional but adaptable database and multiple tools, not just EDC, but Coder and such, that can be implemented on a significantly reduced timeline and reduced cost because we've done a lot of the work for you. So this is a fully functional EDC system, but recognizing, this is where our expertise comes in, knowing that every study is going to be different. Every client has different preferences, and so we've preemptively built in flexibility. We preemptively put in programming to consider. We've utilized, myself and others' data management experience for what kind of things are we looking, what kind of data are we cleaning, et cetera. And then we took that and we confirmed that content against our PICUS database, which is a massive transactional database that looks at what are the procedures that people do in early phase trials, how often are they used, to make sure that we capture the expanse of the type of data you want. And we know that you want to utilize this technology to the fullest. So that's an example of where we have this tool that you can work and partner, with us, and we can consult and help you implement something like that where, as Karen, said earlier, you don't have to reinvent standards. You don't have to define everything from scratch. We're leading you. We're helping you develop your validations. Maybe you have a very small team with folks wearing multiple hats, and so you need a partner that really is invested in your success and can give you their advice. And so that's one example. And so we want to support you in that endeavor. And this is one way we can guarantee you using the highest quality system, but we can reduce the cost and the burden of that initial setup by taking our expertise and helping drive you to get that foundation in place, which then you can perpetuate forward into your future studies.
All right, thanks. Karen, this next question's for you. How much did the selection of a specific service provider versus another play a role in the success or failure of your study?
Good question. So I think kind of the quick answer to that is that really the specific system we use, I would hope, doesn't play a role in the success or failure of our study. I think for me, the success or failure of a study ultimately comes down to science based on whether or not the product works. And there's a lot that goes into that as far as picking the correct indication, dose level, and all of the things that go into trying to figure out if the product you're testing is actually working in people. But as far as the significance of selecting the appropriate service provider, I think it goes a long way to impacting your overall timelines, the cleanliness of your data, the cost of running your studies. So while hopefully there's not a system out there that's going to impact our final results, it will definitely impact how quick you get to those final results. Our site satisfaction with using systems, if we throw something new at them that they've never used before, you're going to have a lot of training issues with your sites. So selecting a system that the sites are familiar with goes a long way to site satisfaction and willingness to enter data for your study. So I would say it won't, just to sum up, it won't impact the success of whether the product works, but definitely will impact how quickly we can get to an answer and move on to the next protocol.
Keith, you mentioned use of sensors in early phase trials. What are regulators saying about medical devices?
That's a really good question, Joe. So there is not today any formal guidance, either out of the EMA or the FDA on sensors. However, they're both expressing optimism for the opportunities and the new types of data that can be accessed with these devices. So in general, we're still waiting for guidance, but the regulators are expressing interest in this data.
Okay, Teresa, what was the significant change made to decrease DBL from 80 days to 5 days?
Sure, great question. So there were several factors. So one of the big ones, of course, was the shift in technology. So this was many years ago, and some of you, maybe if you've been around, remember. So certainly one advantage was, again, moving away from paper, having to have double data entry, doing the manual queries, through the mail. So certainly that alone eliminated a significant amount of time just by having EDC, right? That's available on the web and accessible to everyone at the same time, right? So you can clean data quicker, you can enter data quicker, everyone can see it at the same time. So that was certainly a part of it. But another part of it actually was, I find, to be honest with you, as I work with sponsors, and again, given the nature of the work I do, where I do a lot of the building consulting, I work with a lot of smaller sponsors, and what I find is sometimes it's scary for folks, or actually I should say even at large pharmas, it's kind of scary for folks to use the technology to the fullest, be the most streamlined, get out of the mindset of paper, and not just from a data collection standpoint, get out of the mindset of paper, meaning how we collect data, what kind of dependencies we have, but also utilizing the functionality of the tool. And what I mean by that is, for example, if those of you who have ever used EDC, used our Rave EDC, we have different tools in there. For example, we have ways to mark that SDV is completed. We have ways to mark that reviews are completed. We have ways to, obviously, we can program numerous queries and reports and things like that. And so one of the challenges was, and for some of my folks that maybe have been in data management, one of the challenges that I think all of us have struggled with is we don't trust people to do their jobs, right? We don't often trust that maybe monitors will catch everything, so we double check things, or we over program things. We're not smart and effective in our programming, or we're going to check something in EDC that staff is going to recheck. And there's a lot of overlap. And so one of the biggest changes, not only from switching to paper to technology in general, was using the system to the fullest. And what I mean by that is, at the company I worked for, we developed something called an integrated data review plan. And effectively what this document was a comprehensive document that stated what are the things that are going to be checked in EDC, what are the things that are going to be checked, for example, by reports and data management, what reports or analysis is staff going to do. So it was visible to everybody, and it said this is what everybody is responsible for. And that way we could, A, have insight into their groups so there was no overlap, and then you were held accountable. We had to trust people to do their jobs, and then per your requirements in this plan, you would utilize the system, again, whether it's marking off your review icon or your SDV icon, you were held accountable to utilize that, and the trust in the team was, if you are doing that, that means your review is done. And so you are responsible for that. We're not going to overlap. We're not going to double and triple check things. And we're going to keep track of our workflow. That is part of the benefit of at least I can speak to Rave EDC, right? We have a configurable workflow that we can match just about anything that works with your study team's dynamics. And so we utilize that workflow to capture all these different steps and say, you are responsible. When you say it's done, it's done. And then we didn't overcheck, and when we said it's done, we went and we locked. And so that was a big part of it, was not just the technology switch, but using the tool to the fullest and relying on people to utilize the tool to the fullest and be responsible for their role in the part of the database conduct and closeout part.
All right, Teresa, not done with you yet. We have another question from the audience.
Okay.
In a typical Phase I unit with subject panels with 2-minute staggers, do you use RAVE as eSource or do you use other sources? And if so, how do you transcribe into RAVE?
Thank you so much for that question. So I have to say, in my personal experience, everything that I've observed, it's actually not common to have RAVE as the primary e-source. And a lot of the reasons is a lot of research units that are designated Phase Is, they typically have their own internal system that's really, again, incredibly consistent, systematic, set up to capture that data so there's no data issues because of things like, again, high frequency PK or ECG data or whatever it is. So a lot of times it's most common that they have their own systems to capture that data. So I find that people use RAVE as they want to transfer that data in to have it with their comprehensive study data. And then, so to answer how do we transcribe that into RAVE, certainly you would not want someone to manually transcribe that, right? We want to get away from manual work. We want to use the technology to the fullest so we can take advantage of those people resources in other ways. And so we have a couple of options with RAVE. So RAVE, what's excellent is RAVE is highly integratable, not just with our own systems, but other systems, whether it's IRT or in this case, a Phase I that might have their own, e-source system. And there's a couple of, one example is RAVE Web Services. It's an integration tool that allows for a real-time live integration. They speak through, there's ODM codes back and forth, and so you can, as part of your setup, you can have it so that those systems can speak to each other, and when that data is captured in that Phase I unit, that data can be uploaded to some sort of log or whatever the necessary design is in RAVE. Or I've also seen another example if your Phase I unit doesn't have the capability to have that kind of live real-time integration. We also have a tool that, again, some of you may be familiar with called Batch Uploader, where if your Phase I unit has that data and they're able to extract that data, we can have it such that it's posted to a secure FTP site where, again, there's a tool in RAVE that will actually go and grab that and upload it into RAVE as well. So there's lots of ways that we can take that data and move it into RAVE, even if RAVE is not your original source for that you can ultimately integrate it into your complete study data.
Okay, Karen, which way is faster? Add expansion cohort in Phase I or move to Phase II in certain indications? And Keith, feel free to chime in if you've got an opinion as well.
Yeah, well, I can definitely speak to the fact that for purely based on speed, adding additional cohorts in your Phase I study is going to happen faster. You're going to be able to enroll that cohort of patients quicker just because you don't have to go through the full startup process that you would to start an entirely new Phase II protocol. And I think what you're seeing more and more in industry, especially in oncology world, I can speak to that the most since that's been my most recent experience, but I've been seeing it elsewhere too. The protocols are written as a Phase IB/II study. So right from the get-go, everyone's aware that it's going to quickly merge into that Phase II study. So that's definitely where you see a little bit more speed. And I'm just going to address another question that's kind of related to that, is how to deal with those protocol amendments and adaptive designs in your system. I think going into your study, knowing that things might change and kind of plan for the unknown, which is always hard, but plan for the unknown about where you're likely to have flexibility in the future, where are the protocols going to change so that you don't lock yourself in. My greatest accomplishment is when we're talking around in a room for a study team meeting and people are talking about an upcoming amendment and they look to me to see how long it's going to take to adjust the EDC system. And if I have a nice relaxed look on my face and say, hey, no problem, we got this, I enjoy having the opportunity to say that. It's like, oh, no problem. We're adding an entirely new cohort with a new dosing regimen and a new indication, but that's all right. We got it. So, plan for the unknown as best you can. Keith, did you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, no, I concur. That matches our experience and what our clients are asking us to do as well.
All right, looks like we're coming up on our final question. Had a lot of great questions today. Unfortunately, couldn't get to them all, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. So our final question is for the entire panel. Why don't we start off with you, Teresa? Before we wrap up, what advice would you like attendees to take away from this webinar?
Oh, sure, absolutely. So I think the final takeaway is, again, I recognize that it's a significant investment up front and can often be a lot of work, but we really want you to think beyond one study, right? We want you to be successful. We want to anticipate your success with what you're developing. So think beyond one study, think beyond one phase, envision your long-term success, and then partner with the experts. You know, let us help you get there. Let us help you do some of that work.
Keith, what's your advice?
So, yeah, definitely be really smart, be thoughtful about your protocol design. You know, think about how many dynamic data points that you're going to have. And building on what Teresa just said, your CRO, your lab, your technology providers can provide suggestions and cost-effective solutions, different options based off of their vast experience. So leverage their experience.
Karen?
Sure. Yeah. So I think, well, most of what we talked about today was talking about, you know, utilizing systems and standards to accomplish our goals. We touched on slightly in some of our answers what I think is really the most important aspect of how we can move quickly in things, and that's with the experience of the people who are actually doing the work. These systems support people, but it's those great in-house resources that you have, or those service providers and the CRO personnel that you've trained on your studies. They've gotten into the study. They're engaged in the science and the work and the people that they're working with. I truly believe that that's the way you can move things forward fastest, because if you have a group of people who want to work hard for your studies, they want to work hard for the team that they're part of, they can really accomplish a lot. So I think all this technology and the systems, they're really something that can be utilized to support the people so that people can have a more efficient way of working and focus on what really matters. I think that's my biggest piece. I really, really like it, whether they're in-house folks or people that I've worked with and the functional service providers. I want everyone to feel part of my study team. And then it's just great to work with a bunch of good people.
All great advice. I'd like to thank the audience for attending this Fierce Markets webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd also like to thank our speakers for participating and Medidata for presenting today's webinar. A reminder to the audience, the webinar has been recorded and you will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.